The US elections are finally over, and by many indications, we have a major realignment in the American political landscape. Donald Trump was able to flip one swing state after the other. Counties that Biden and even Hillary Clinton won by clear margins not long ago were now won by Trump. Huge reversals in favor of the Republican Party. And for the first time in history, you may not only have a trifecta, a Republican, in fact, a MAGA trifecta, in the White House, in the House likely, and in the Senate, but you also have a Supreme Court, which is quite conservative, and at least 3 members of that were appointed by Donald Trump. What does this mean for America? And more importantly, what does this mean for the rest of the world? Will Trump approach his foreign policy this time quite differently from the first time? What will be the continuities and what will be the changes? And should we in the Philippines welcome these changes and potential continuities? Thank you very much, Satu, for joining us.
Yes.
A lot to talk about here. Obviously, America's policy in this part of the world in the coming years, continuities and also departures that are very much expected. And how can we think about Asia without thinking about the European theater or the West Asian and Middle Eastern theater?
Indeed.
And not to mention the internal games within the ASEAN. But I know you're non-partisan and everything like that. From what we understand when it comes to the data and the numbers coming in, I think we have sufficient data and numbers coming in terms of understanding what on earth happened in the latest elections. Because Trump winning is not a big surprise to a lot of observers. It's just a margin, right? Including the states he flipped, the counties he flipped, the inroads he made among the minority groups, among others, Latino men very strong, for instance. What is your understanding here? Is this a realignment situation we're looking at? This kind of a once-in-a-generation, reshuffling and upending of the political map in the United States? Or maybe this is more of a phenomenon that may not last over the long time.
Well, thank you, first of all, Richard, for having me on. Delighted to be here in Manila. Of course, the results of the U.S. election are really, I think, quite extraordinary. It certainly is a realignment from 4 years ago in every conceivable way. The popular vote victory of now President-elect Trump, the control of the Senate, potentially the House. Some races are still to be called as we speak. The way in which the electorate shifted right, both in blue states as well as traditional states, the margins of victories in some states, such as Florida, as you rightly pointed out, African-American, Latino groups, etc. So I do personally read the data as something of a fundamental judgment and realignment in American politics. Sustainability, durability, where it goes from here, that I can't predict. But I think a new tone has been set, at least for the new 4 years, for the next 4 years. And exactly what that means for a range of foreign policy, security, and the area that I work on, which is U.S. Indo-Pacific relations, I think potentially could be quite significant. But I would also say that there are going to be some elements of continuity.
Right. Well, speaking of continuity, we saw a lot of continuity, from Trump to Biden administration. And I think the bipartisan consensus, the coordinates of that were very much set, from my understanding, going to the DC 2016-17 onwards. And I was like, okay, because I remember in early 2000s when the Philippines filed the arbitration case, things we'll discuss later on, we kind of look like, outside the curve, right? When we talk about the Chinese threat, among others, there was still this strong, more or less consensus or understanding that China has to be engaged with. But I was not feeling that anymore by 2017, 18, and 19. Ironically, just as the Philippines was trying to reset things.
Right.
And so when Biden was coming in, I was very confident, telling friends in Taiwan, telling friends in Philippines, no. This idea that Democrats are going to be softer, etc., it's not going to happen. It's just going to be a tactical difference, maybe more multilateralist in tone, a little bit more economic initiative focused. But we saw a tremendous amount of continuity from Trump to Biden administration, including on our alliance and the Ireland commitment to the parameters of the Mutual Defense Treaty. So what are the points of continuity you expect under Trump 2.0 right now?
So I think there are probably, in my judgment, 3 large continuities and a set of more tactical continuities. And let me lay those out.
So strategic and tactical.
Strategic and tactical. On the strategic level, I think one continuity will be the hardening of the U.S.-China relationship, hardening strategic competition. Now, as you well know, that process began in the Trump administration around 2017 with the issuance of the first leaked Indo-Pacific strategy.
Right.
Many of those elements you see threads picked up in the one that was released by the Biden administration. And particularly during the pandemic, it became a very hard turn on China. That continued through the Biden administration. And it's not just the executive branch, but the American public and the American Congress has been particularly active in this hardening of strategic competition.
Right.
The laws, the bills, the resolutions, the oversight. I mean, the US Congress just a few weeks ago finished China Week. And if you appreciate the congressional calendar, the fact that a week was devoted to, hundreds of, I can't name them all, hundreds of bills, measures related to China,
wow,
will give you an indication that this is not just the White House. This is Congress, it's across the aisle, there's real effort. So that's continuity one, the hardening strategic competition vis-a-vis China. And there will be some nuances and probably some shifts, so we'll have to watch for that, how it's implemented, how far it goes. The second continuity I think that's really important is sort of the breakdown of consensus about free trade.
Right.
And yes, the Biden administration had this major initiative, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. As you'll know, the Pillar 1, the market access, was sort of taken away at around the time of APEC, which was held in San Francisco
last November.
Yeah. I am doubtful that that's a priority of the incoming administration. We'll have to see what their formal announcement. But both sides of the aisle, Democrat and Republican, have not been particularly open or receptive to new free trade agreements.
Since Obama.
Since Obama days. And certainly multilateral free trade agreements. Right. And the TPP, once that went away, once that effort never materialized, I think there just is no going back there anytime soon. So that's the second. And the third one I think is really important is a kind of degree, how you measure, how you weight it is open to question. And that's what I call insulationism. Not isolationism, not a withdrawal behind a fortress walls, but a kind of selective, protective approach to international affairs. And that's kind of a battle within both parties. Are we seeking primacy in leadership? Are we seeking selective engagement? Are we only protecting allies and friends? And I'd say a fourth continuity in that spirit is a much more selective way of managing relationships. So alliances, partners, but all on their bilateral basis or small configurations. What I've called from wheels, hubs and spokes agreements, to webs, which was kind of big multilateralism, East Asia Summit, ARF, all of those big
spaghetti bowl,
to what I call wires, where you have very select wire points to partners.
And you tighten it. And
U.S., Japan are okay. The Dutch, Japan, and the U.S. on semiconductors. Japan, Philippines, U.S.
And then AUKUS.
And then, of course, AUKUS and the Quad. So these are very kind of what I call a significant trend line that will be comfortable to the new administration, too. After all, you'll recall that Quad was given a boost, revived, if you will, under the Trump administration and moved towards leader-level meetings. And that was continued by the Biden administration. So as you can see, there are these four big continuities. And then, of course, as I said, tactically, there are some continuities. I mean, the alliances aren't going away. Our military presence in the region is not immediately, in any sense, going to go away. The Quad's not going away. So I think
those are the four major continuities. What would be the continuity from Trump 1.0 to Trump 2.0 that may not hold anymore? Or what are the potential departures? Now let's talk about the departures. What could be the departures not only from Biden administration, but also from 1.0 Trump administration? Could there conceivably be a significant departure?
Yeah, that
again, we're speculative
we're
at this point.
speculative
Obviously,
on this point. Yeah, you know, one of the things I've been thinking about is, I think, given what it seems to me the public has said about the focus on economics, etc., a very, very heavy focus on domestic economic issues. There were, of course, in the first administration also, but I think that's one I would flag.
Onshoring,
getting
industrial
manufacturing
policy,
jobs back. You know, there's been some chatter about China's growing trade deficit with the U.S. The surplus China is running with the U.S. deficit, and which will embolden, I think, people to say, let's put tariffs, right, to lower that deficit. So
but
think
we already saw that during Trump 1.0.
We
so what
did
will be the difference?
Much broader, perhaps much harder-nosed, harder-edged negotiations, in my judgment. Probably, and we've heard some snippets from the incoming team. People have spoken.
Like Pfizer coming back?
People say that he's going to play some sort of role. I obviously don't know. But people are saying things like maybe graded in tariffs over time as a negotiation. Because, I mean, these tariffs range from, you know, people are using different numbers, 60%, 20% for everybody else, 60% for China. Will it all come in at once? Hard to see that.
Sequencing.
How the sequencing, how they might be ramped up, where they will be used for negotiations. I think that's all open to question. But I do think that will be a major focus of the incoming administration. And then I think a whole set of domestic issues that I'm not, you know, qualified to.
But the other, again, the caveat is, this is disclaimer, this is speculative, but we saw a lot of the Mattis and McMaster and Kellys in his first term. And I think President Trump made it absolutely clear that he's going to approach things quite differently. At the same time, we're hearing the names of some of the former senior officials. National Security Advisor O'Brien, people like Elbridge Corby, we had him on this show, who are very much, I think, in a good position to end up in senior positions. So is this going to be a mix of MAGA loyalists and very much adults in the room who know their job, or we're going to see something completely different, or we're going to see still a version, an iteration of what we already saw in the past?
You know, this is really speculative.
And does it even matter? Does it even matter that who
I do think it matters.
It matters.
I think it matters. I think it matters because 2016 was the first term. There's been considerable time to prep for this term. There are a number of major figures on Wall Street who have joined that campaign. There are major bankers, hedge fund managers. There are people, as you quite rightly said, from the previous administration who are currently, their names are appearing in the press as potential candidates. There are senators being suggested for potential Secretary of State, like Senator Rubio, Senator Haggerty. So these names, you know, we could speculate forever. We'll get an announcement in due course before January 20th and the inauguration. But I think what's really striking here is there has been preparation time, and there are names. Chief of Staff has already been named. Susan Wiles from his campaign. So I think there appears to be much more preparation for this handling of this term.
And it does matter, right?
And I think it really does.
We have to, because I think there's, I mean, of course, the thing with President Trump is that he's a very forceful figure, and he has strong opinions on things. We can go back to, you know, the advertisements he would post on New York Times, back in the day. You know, he was paying for that. So that means he has strong feelings. But at the same time, you have to understand there's a bureaucracy, there's a process. You cannot expect, you know, the gentleman on top to, you know, micromanage everything when it comes to foreign policy. So it does matter. So
it does.
In short, we have to carefully watch what's going to come about. I remember earlier this year, we had a conversation in Stanford, and people like Francis Fukuyama were there. And they kept on, you know, and this idea of Schedule F. Kept on popping up.
Political appointees.
Yeah, which is, you know, this idea that, you know, there's supposed a deep state, we call it the national security state. Do you expect, again, this is extremely speculative, that there'll be some movement on that front? Because the last time that was not the case, right? Could this be the other departure?
this is not my terrain, but I guess my view is political appointees, by definition, are political appointees. And whoever he or she is, who is the president,
it's his prerogative.
It's his prerogative.
Yeah.
Many of these political appointees, the ones that are required, have to go through the Senate confirmation process. We know that he has a majority in the Senate. I think there may be one or two races still to be finally declared. There seems to be a trend towards him controlling the House as well. That's not necessary for Senate confirmation, obviously, but important. In other words, President Trump, it seems to me, given the political configuration, will have considerable autonomy and choice to select who he wants to select.
And much more crystallized idea of what he wants.
And I suspect he and or his staff around him who have been preparing for this victory are ready to go and have some pretty clear ideas about what they want and don't want.
Right. Don't worry, that's too much of domestic. We'll get another guest for that. Don't worry, Satu. Now let's go to the meat of discussion. Yeah. Now, my understanding is, yes, U.S. is a superpower, tremendous amount of global military footprint. Yeah. And I do agree that there's going to be continuity in terms of a China-focused foreign policy, China first in terms of, this is our strategic competitor. What I wonder is, to what degree can we insulate, speaking of insulate, America's China policy from the ongoing conflicts and potentially festering conflicts in other parts of the world? Maybe the Ukraine one is drawing down, but the one in the Middle East doesn't look like moving in that direction. Yeah. It could move in a completely different direction.
Sure.
Based on some of the early indications we're seeing. If you are in the Philippines or in Asia, any major Asian capital, to what degree should you care about what's happening in the Middle East, for instance, or other theaters? And to what degree should you hope that there'll be significant calibration in the American approach there? Because China is a near competitor, a near peer competitor. I mean, the amount of influence China deploys in this part of the world, economic, social, diplomatic, my sense is, and you may disagree with me, is that U.S. has to be very careful with other theaters, because the idea of America being able to compete and even fight wars in 2 or 3 major theaters. We saw the RAND Corporation study, a bipartisan study in U.S. Congress. All of them suggest to me that U.S. has to be much more, careful and calibrated, because China is such a huge challenge that you have to make sure you don't get into something funny in other parts of the world. What is your reading of that? How important it is to also insulate the China competition here in Asia from a kind of adventurous mistake or faux pas elsewhere?
Yeah, I mean, look, there is a very big debate about where American priorities should be.
Right.
There is a very vocal, very well-informed, very erudite group of folks who say, listen, what are we doing in Ukraine? What are we spending our time in the Ukraine, Russia? This is not the show. The show is in Asia, and the show is with this peer competitor, and we need to harden strategic competition and make this choice. This is the so-called, I mean, other ways have put it over the last 10 years, you've written about it, you've spoken about it, Richard, is the so-called pivot or rebalance. Yeah. America needs to pivot. Now, our documents say very clearly that China is the DOD document. Say China is the pacing threat.
Right.
And it says that the Indo-Pacific is the primary theater of interest. But that was before Russia invaded Ukraine, and that was before the Middle East war broke out. Now, it is as an analyst of Indo-Pacific U.S. relations, my sense is that there have been complaints that we haven't made the pivot. We haven't made the rebalance. And, you can read the Bob Blackwell and
The Lost Decade.
The Lost Decade. Richard Fontaine's book. Yeah. And so this case, as I said, is very much at play. Is what should we be doing? Covering that debate is also, as I said, this insulationist, more focused domestic, versus the primacists, versus other kind of schools of thought, which is, sure, China is a peer competitor. China is doing very aggressive things, creating a lot of trouble, both for the U.S. as well as allies and partners all over the world. But here's how I come down. One, the notion that we can isolate one theater from the other is a bygone era.
Right.
You have potential North Korea troops fighting Ukraine.
In Europe, yeah.
And you have 4 members in the Indo-Pacific who are IP4 members of NATO: Japan, Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. And Korea and Japan, under the current leadership, in fact, former Prime Minister Kishida made a major statement about how important Ukraine was to addressing issues in the
And the new one is talking even about Asian NATO.
And talking about an Asian NATO, but because of the results of the election, we'll just have to see where Mr. Ishiba's future and the LDP future and what the coalition is in Japan. So I obviously don't know. So if one is, the first point I would take away is that notion of choosing one or the other is not there. Second, in the Middle East. The Middle East is something the United States cannot simply walk away from. We have both Israel as a partner, we have Arab countries as partners, and this question of Iran is very heavily infused into our American body politic. There are some newspaper articles circulating today that the Trump administration, as you know, during the campaign was very critical of the Biden administration for giving it allegedly money that would sponsor Hezbollah activities and what have you.
The maximum pressure campaign was
the maximum pressure campaign was taken off the burner, and it's going to be put back on. So as I look at this, first of all, the U.S. can do many things simultaneously. So I think there will be the tariffs and the strategic competition hardening with China. I think that President-elect Trump has made it very clear, has said publicly, that he thinks he has a way to resolve or find an end state to this Ukraine-Russia situation. And what it is, we'll obviously hear in due course, but I do think that will be a priority. I think it'll be a priority in his relations with NATO, et cetera. So I do not foresee an either-or choice. I think that the priorities I see will be this handling Ukraine.
Right.
And when I say Ukraine, I mean Ukraine, Russia, NATO. I think second, I think a maximum restraint, maximum pressure on Iran, and continuing strong support for Israel to defeat Hezbollah and Hamas and extremists and terrorists. And then simultaneously, in parallel, very much a focus, particularly on the economic dimensions with China as part of the strategic hardening competition.
So it could be electric vehicles, it could be semiconductors, artificial intelligence.
It could be a whole range of products. I couldn't even begin to speculate on which product, what level. But they've made it very clear that that's something they want to do.
Is
they've
this
announced
the risk plus? Because I think everyone has realized decoupling is quite impossible almost, given the size and scale of China, and which keeps on growing. I mean, every year, our good friend Ambassador Kosikan Bilahari, or I wonder, someone pointed out that mathematically every year China is adding an Australia to its GDP.
To its GDP.
That just gives you a sense of even a slowdown China is
still becoming
steamroller, economic steamroller. So,
which is exactly the contrast with people who say that China has been collapsing, but they've been saying it for 30 years. I mean, there seems to be no doubt that China is running into some real troubles, demographically, economic slowdown, debt, etc. But its trade figures, as of today, in the Michael Pettis Twitter feed, is 12.5% deficit with the United States. Doesn't appear to be a major slowdown. Many European companies, such as Germany in particular, continue to believe that China is offering a major research and innovation hub. There are reports in newspapers saying that China is moving along the technological ladder.
The ASPI reports that 6 out of 7 critical industries, they're already
Correct.
a leader.
And also semiconductors, the super refined ones. So it's hard for me to see coming collapse of China. I would also say, yes, China may well be adding Australia. I hadn't heard that particular way of framing it. But I would just note that in 2023, the U.S. grew more than Europe and China combined. Our economy is still 25, round number, $25 trillion.
Which has kept steady in terms of share of global GDP over the past quarter century.
That's right. So I wouldn't, and the way the stock market has reacted to the President-elect Trump administration is, going through the roof. Now, whether that is sustainable or not, we don't know. But there is a sense that the juices of the U.S. economy are about to be set free. And tax breaks. And as you know, the Federal Reserve cut the interest rates by 1/4 point. So my point is, we also have a scenario back as a backdrop to all of the security strategy of what appears to be potential for two very vibrant economies seeking to de-risk and selectively decouple.
Right.
And the question is, who can sustain how much for how long first?
The staying power.
The staying power.
Yeah.
Who suffers the most? Because, you know, questions have been raised. If you put too much tariffs, will it create inflationary pressures?
Yeah, of course.
But is it China that really needs to export to earn these, to earn the foreign currency for its economy?
And not to mention, U.S. is democracy in 2 years in midterm elections. It could come back to haunt this administration if the inflation picks up. I really like your insulationism approach, because I always felt, how can America be isolationist when you
cannot?
It's just like
impossible.
The coupling. It's physically impossible. What is this whole transactionalism argument? Because there's some critics who are saying that the Trump administration may seem like much more, I would say, some would even say gangster, like, try to coax and cajole other allies and all. But many critics would say, well, that's the rhetoric and that's the poetry, but actually in operation, all American administration to a certain degree would always want to leverage the asymmetry of power and etc. So maybe you're making too much out of this transactionalist argument. Nevertheless, we can expect that this emphasis on shared democratic values perhaps will not be as emphasized in the Quad, or not be there. You won't have democracy summit perhaps every year as you had. Is that important? Is that what you see the direction that America is going to take in the coming years? Because a lot of people who may end up in senior positions are much more classical realists.
Yes. That
they feel injection of moral rhetoric and discourse may not be only narcissistic, but actually could even have counterproductive effects. Right. Is this the kind of transactionalism we're going to see? That this idea that let's not just pretend that we're all beacons of perfection. We are countries that are protecting our national interests and want a more or less stable order.
Yeah. Well, people use labels. As an analyst, I try not to be overly
putting too much stock into
too much stock in it, but I try to see underneath if I can. And here's what I see.
Right.
A 40-year narrative of American presidents asking allies and partners to do more, spend more on defense.
Burden sharing.
There's nothing new about this. You can read every speech of every Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, American presidents saying, you need to spend more, you need to do more, we need more support. Nothing new about this. Phases, ebbs, flows, how much, how it's said, etc. I think one thing we can take away from President Trump's previous administration is he is absolutely demanding of it.
Right, right.
If you want to label that transactionalism, certainly that is one's prerogative.
Yep.
I guess I see it as very much an earthy expression of a long-standing U.S. policy that allies should do more. And as you note, both in the 2016-2020 period, but also now, all the congratulatory messages that I've been reading, to the extent I can get my hands on them, people have been making the case that their relationship with the U.S. benefits American workers through jobs and through economy. The Singapore Prime Minister's issue, I believe he used the phrase 260,000 jobs due to a combination of trade and investment. Something along those lines. One can check the details.
So the brochures have been...
The brochures and the briefings are very clear. We're doing this and this. Right. You'll remember that Abe and Kishida made very clear, we're doubling our defense spending. We're going to buy these counter-strike weapons. We're going to do this with the U.S. We'll pick up these burdens. Now, you can call it whatever you want, but I think what states are doing as partners and allies of the U.S. is saying, okay, here's how we're meeting these expectations or these long-standing policy pronouncements. Mm-hmm. Now, people have different views about how these things should be framed and negotiated. What's the trade-off? But I think the real important thing is in each of these cases in the previous, whether it was NAFTA becoming USMCA was completed. great criticism of the Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement was completed.
Right.
The 20th anniversary of the U.S.-Singapore FTA. Very little discussion about the U.S.-Australia FTA, right?
So it works. That's what you're saying?
What I'm saying is those didn't go away.
Mm.
No one rescinded the Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement. There were some negotiations, there were some criticisms, but they went forward. USMCA went forward. Now there are criticisms and repeats and reviews and looks at different things, but my point is, here's another element of continuity. Those alliances and partnerships didn't go away. In fact, they expanded. You can see that with India. You can see that in both Trump's first administration and with Biden and the strengthening of the U.S.-Philippine agreement, despite, if I may say, more changes in the Philippines than in the United States.
Right.
But yet the relationship overall,
the direction of the wind,
has managed to weather those storms in a systematic ways that are not wildly dissimilar between the two administrations.
Right.
You see this with the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership with Vietnam, despite criticism of Vietnam running a large trade deficit with the United States. You see a Comprehensive Strategic Partnership with ASEAN. You see a Comprehensive Strategic Partnership with Indonesia in the new election of Prabowo.
Right.
After all, Prabowo was allowed to visit during the Trump administration.
After all those years of
when there were travel restrictions. So my point is, it is easy to focus on differences. It makes for a lot of press and a lot of speculation. I'm trying to watch what really changes.
Right.
And what I'm suggesting is there will be degrees of continuity, as I've said earlier, both at the strategic level and at the tactical level. And in Southeast Asia, I don't see any massive changes. I simply don't see. I agree on the following things. Probably a little less focus on democracy.
Right.
Probably a little less focus on normative standards.
Right.
Far more focus on trade and trade balances and export and deficits and what have you. Some concerns about elements of onshoring and offshoring and those kind of things. But for example, the Thai statement by the Commerce Minister really struck me, is selling Thailand as an important place to do business with the United States.
Right.
So I'm watching and trying to absorb in these first 72 hours. It's been, literally 3-4 days.
We have been together in the last, and I've noticed that this is really you. I won't say you're nonchalant, but I think I see a lot of confidence in the direction of our bilateral relationship, not only Philippines and US, but also ASEAN. Nevertheless, there is going to be, I call it 50 shades of hedging, many shades of responses here. Yeah. Obviously, 10 countries have very different approaches. One of them is in the midst of the civil war as we speak.
Sure.
But let's just talk about a couple of countries. I don't want to call them core countries, that might be politically incorrect. But let's say you're Vietnam right now.
Yes.
Who has been very much benefiting from a couple of things, including from friendshoring, right? Nevertheless, we hear from certain quarters in the U.S. that, maybe Mexicans are taking too much advantage of this, that China is putting their production sites there, that maybe it has to move across the border. If you are Vietnam right now, how should you feel about the return of the Trump administration? What are the preparations you have to make? And to what degree do you think they can keep things on an even keel? Because the even keel is very good for them so far. They are the multi-alignment star here, along with India.
Yeah. Well, I have always said that Vietnam is extremely able at managing great power relationships.
Right.
The history of Vietnam.
The maestro. Yeah.
They have managed 5 members of the Security Council.
Right. The French.
They've fought wars with 2 of them, or 3 of them.
Yeah.
They've navigated 2 socialist fraternal countries during the post-75 period. This is not a country that doesn't know how to operate in the international space. And you've seen that from Doi Moi onwards to its relationships with Europe, its relationships managing the U.S.-China strategic competition, its signing up and becoming part of ASEAN, its relationships with other powers in the region, such as Korea and India, for example. So I have very little doubt that Vietnam can manage a second Trump administration. And the empirical evidence or data set for this, as alleged analysts, is they did during the first administration. He came to Hanoi for the, wasn't Hanoi, but wherever Vietnam hosted APEC, as you'll recall. For
Da Nang, if I'm not mistaken.
Da Nang, that's right. I couldn't remember exactly where they'd hosted it. So he was there for that. He was also, Hanoi was one of the choices for the North Korean leaders meeting.
Right.
So he's not an unknown figure. He's not a figure they're meeting for the first time. It's an administration they've got. Now, there's been criticism in Congress, and it hasn't come from the Trump administration about the deficit.
Right.
There are issues, right? And it hasn't come from the Trump administration. I mean, it will or could come from the Trump, but it's also been on the Democratic side. Right. Which is, hey, what's Vietnam
for
doing?
Currency manipulation? I mean, the Biden administration launched an investigation.
All kinds of things. Yeah. So, again, continuity. What's really different here? What's the same? So on Vietnam, I quite frankly think this, especially in the 30th year, which is the 30th year of normalization of U.S.-Vietnam relations in 2025, I think this will be a potentially banner year for U.S.-Vietnam relations. Will there be differences? Of course there'll be differences. But overall, we've
manageable, very manageable.
So that's my answer on Vietnam. I don't know what
I think I very much agree with you. I think we're on the same page in this. What about Indonesia? Because Prabowo is a very interesting figure. I mean, I always said Indonesia is kind of becoming like India in a sense that it has a very strong sense of itself, very self-confident. Prabowo is, I watched his interviews in English language. Yes. He's a Sandhurst graduate. Right. And my sense with him is that he could go down the Modi route, which is, yes, I have grievance. For a while I was not allowed in the U.S. There was some sort of stigma around me, just like, you know, in the case of Prime Minister Modi. But if there's enough embrace from Trump, and these are two strong personalities, enough of Gulf diplomacy for that matter, I'm quite optimistic about where these things go, because my sense is under Jokowi, there was some sort of lukewarmness that you could blame both sides for it. Yes. You know, but with Prabowo, I think the potential is immense for taking this to the next level. And Trump is a perfect guy to deal with someone like Prabowo, right? And vice versa, I would say.
Well, as you know, Southeast Asia has had a number of very strong leaders.
Right.
And I would say that President Trump certainly presents and symbolizes strong leadership. Yeah. And he speaks about strong leaders. He speaks about their effectiveness. He's, you know, and this is controversial. In some cases, he praises leaders that many Americans don't think should be praised. Yeah. But the point for Southeast Asia is that there's nothing here that I can discern that would put President Trump off his paces or any current Southeast Asian leader off their paces.
Right.
They all have, the bureaucracies of these countries in Southeast Asia have experience dealing with President Trump.
They're Trump-proofed.
And that, well, or maybe the way I would say is they're Trump normative in the sense they've had those interactions. Right. So I don't think they'll be thrown off. Prabowo and Indonesia is an interesting case because you know this very well, Richard, is Indonesia is not a country that pops up to the top of our agenda.
Compared to the size
and the scale. Compared to the size,
brings,
importance, scale, weight. And this is your earlier question about the Middle East. The Middle East issues refracted very heavily in Indonesia and in Malaysia.
Gaza.
Other places too, Gaza, of course. So I think whether that could be an area of continuing dissonance, given where President Trump and his administration is on Iran, on Israel, on the Middle East, on Palestine issues in general. But as you know, President Prabowo has been very pragmatic. He's come to the United States, I believe, 3 or 4 times. Yeah. He has sought the comprehensive strategic partnership. He has subtly welcomed AUKUS. He has no particular problems with the Quad. There's nothing about Indonesian foreign policy that seems to me a block on relations with Washington. The Middle East, to be sure, but given the larger issues that President Prabowo seems to want to deal with, including the recent Chinese aggression in the Tuna Sea, I would think that there's a lot of areas where we might work together.
And you are, right? I mean,
And
we saw this IISS study saying, oh, despite all the discussion, this is the number of military exercises between Indonesia and US, and this is China. Like, it's not even
That's right.
at the same level.
That's right. So I think there's a very high ceiling for US-Indonesia relations.
Right.
And the question is, are people going to build the kind of floors and work at meeting those high ceilings? And I think it's really possible to do because it won't be overlaid with too many other issues. The question is, does Indonesia really want to deal with the US on military stuff, arms stuff, security stuff, diplomatic stuff? Is that possible? Are they keen on this? I mean, as you well know, Indonesia has announced a cabinet. President Prabowo has announced a cabinet, I think it's around 128 members. So how will this be coordinated? How will they come to the new
Japanese?
So we'll see. But I again, as with Vietnam, I don't foresee any hurdles to maintaining that relationship.
But what about Malaysia? Because with Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim, who sometimes I think is still in his activist intellectual mode. I mean, we could see that also in the interaction he had with Chancellor Scholz earlier this year. He's, well, in a way, doing a Mahathir 2.0, this kind of a leader of the Islamic Ummah, or one of the leaders of Islamic world, and making all these clarion calls against supposed Western hypocrisy. Do you think that's just performative? And all of the good things he's saying about China, you know, don't be, you know, because that is getting a lot of attention, including in the Philippines, because we'll discuss lastly the Philippines, obviously. In the Philippines, the sense is like, why are they doing this? They, just like us, have problems with China in the South China Sea. And it's not like we're fighting with them over Sabah issue. Why is Anwar doing this? Didn't they learn their lesson from the Najib years and all of those corruption scandals and questionable deals? Why is he acting like, kind of like Duterte back in the day, of lawyering for China and just focusing on the shortcomings of the West? I mean, I can talk about Gaza, but I can also talk about the Uyghurs and the Muslim communities persecution.
But he doesn't.
He doesn't. And that's raising a lot of theories. And I don't want to go to some of them. I think some of them are left off the record, and some of them we can discuss in a separate platform. But what is your understanding with Malaysia? Do you think, again, this is a very forceful personality, knows America very well. Do you think Trump can find the right alchemy to make sure that there's no hemorrhage? Because now Anwar's talking about BRICS. I think I wouldn't be surprised to see him embracing both Pezeshkian of Iran and Putin of Russia in the coming years. He even said that he's not going to apologize for his relations with Hamas, institutional ties with Malaysia. We're hearing all of those stuff. Do you think that there'll be a recalibration on both sides enough to create the right alchemy? Or Malaysia may have crossed the line, that hedging is perhaps increasingly impossible given their conditions? Sorry, I'm throwing a lot out there. Just to give you a sense. That's a lot.
I'm going to be a little blunt. I'm not sure Malaysia will be at the top of the list
of
priorities, given what I've said about Ukraine, NATO, and Russia, that whole package of issues. Maximum pressure on Iran and handling the Middle East, and articulating this international economic strategy around tariffs as well as sort of the strategic competition with China. So I don't see Malaysia in that picture very much. So that's point one. It's a little blunt. Second, it assumes that we're going to have Anwar Ibrahim, Prime Minister Ibrahim, there for a longish time. Let us see, because Malaysia...
He'll be the ASEAN chair next year, because that's my issue.
Definitely, Oh, in that context,
You know what I'm saying?
Well, as you know, not all presidents go to all meetings.
True.
And I can't see next November-ish time frame where the president-elect Trump will choose to go. But I'm not sure that will be the driving consideration, that I can't go because it will damage U.S.-Malaysia relations. There may be other things going on in Washington. There may be other world crises. There may be other priorities, as happened in the Biden administration, Obama administration.
100%,
So those are 2 points. I'm puzzled by Prime Minister Ibrahim's comments. They're difficult for me to understand, given a lot of empathy and understanding of his previous years out of office in the United States. Sometimes it strikes me a little bit of these very individual relationships that develop in our country relationships in Southeast Asia, like with Aung San Suu Kyi, which differed considerably on Rohingya and Rakhine State. Here we have some significant differences with Prime Minister Ibrahim on Middle East and some of his criticisms in China, etc. The bottom line, of course, is just remember this. Both on the commercial side and the defense security side, the U.S. and Malaysia have worked very productively together.
Absolutely.
It's been lower throttle, lower key. It hasn't had the spikes and flows of the U.S.-Philippine relationship. It hasn't been kind of melancholic like the U.S.-Thai alliance relationship. But it's been steady, and it's some good grace that it's not at the top of the agenda, because it's easy to kind of continue our constructive, productive, professional activities without kind of getting roiled in a big issue that hits the papers. Right? And that's not a bad thing. Sometimes you don't want every relationship to be in the highlight. I mean, the U.S.-Philippine relationship is very much on in the papers because of South China Sea. We've had very dramatic issues, and this transition, right, from Duterte to Mr. Marcos.
Because in the Philippines, I think more than any other Asian capital I've visited over the past year, even among U.S. allies, from Berlin to Tokyo, what have you, there's a lot of optimism about the direction of the bilateral relations under Trump administration. They love what they're hearing from the O'Briens and the Elbridge of this world. We have to help the Philippines, almost similar to countries like Israel, because this is a frontline state. This is a key state. Even the recognition that the Philippines was taken for granted for a long time, which is a fact. And Ambassador Romualdez has told us on this show that it's not like we're there to beg Americans. We'll do our part. We're now becoming a middle power. It's a mid-sized economy, mid-sized nation.
Correct.
And we are not just important in South China Sea. Taiwan issue, we're very much at the heart of that question. And with Japan, we have this trilateral I call JAFUS.
And good relations with Australia and other allies.
Absolutely. So where do you think this Philippines-U.S. relations go before we end? Because I think this is a perfect way to end this very interesting conversation, And what are things you have to put together to make the most out of the next 4 years, perhaps, even more normatively?
I have to tell you that, one of the things that strikes me is we, the United States and Philippines, have this extraordinarily complex relationship. I think I'm correct in saying you, the Philippines, is the only country that has voted to remove U.S. troops from its territory. And we went, and then came back in. Over the last 6-7 years or so, we've had dramatic differences in the attitude towards the United States from Philippine leadership. And yet, the ballast has held. Yes, we were circumscribed. Yes, there were limitations at certain points about what we could and couldn't do. But the core relationship remains still viable and workable. And now it is in a very positive state. You're asking me about what the Trump administration will do, and it's a fair question. My hunch is they'll do what they did during the first administration, which is make very strong statements in support of the Philippines and continuing ongoing efforts to build better productive relations on capabilities, capacities. At this recent conference, first Manila South China Sea Dialogue, the Commandant of the Philippine Coast Guard announced the acquisition of new ships, etc. So all of this works to the U.S.-Filipino alliance advantage. The question I would ask as an American is, where does the Philippines go after its midterm elections and its run-up to its presidential elections? Because President Marcos has one term. So I am very optimistic. I think we're in a very positive phase and trajectory of the U.S.-Philippine relationship after some hard slogs over the past few years. But I think in this particular relationship case, the deciding variable will be more Manila than it will be Washington. I think there is an open door in Washington to support the Philippines. How much is Philippines willing to walk through that door?
We had the polished foreign minister also in the show, who used to be the former defense minister. And as you know, Poland also has a very domestically polarized situation.
Yes.
Nevertheless, our sense that we could be the Poland in this part of the world, just next to a potential
Poland has had a rough history, I hope.
Rough history,
yeah.
But they're on a very positive trajectory.
Yeah, very much so.
In terms of their economy, in terms of their defense capabilities, and they're playing a very important geopolitical role.
Absolutely.
And our sense is, we're not exactly Poland in terms of the depth of tragedy in the past, but nevertheless, we have had our own very difficult moments of being tossed in between different empires. And the sense is, we can insulate enough, institutionalize enough our position in the region and our relationship with the U.S. in spite of the domestic indeterminacy.
Yes.
Although personally, I'm also very optimistic about where things are going in the Philippines, because you have 80-90% stance against China here.
That's right.
You're not going to get that anywhere else.
And similar support for the U.S. alliance and U.S. relationship.
Absolutely. And at least 70% saying we have to work strongly with Japan and U.S. and like-minded powers.
Absolutely right.
So whoever is the next president, including a possible another Duterte, will have a very hard time next time around to do what the former Duterte was supposed to.
I very much hope you're right. But I want to keep an open mind about that, because domestic politics are an important variable.
But Satu, we'll only know the truth in 2028, but what assumptions we have about 2020 will shape what we do today. This is classic game theory.
And classic game theory. And I would say, this is why I say, I foresee zero change in the U.S.-Philippine relationship because of the Trump administration's victory. That is to say, a very positive, forward-looking relationship, very heavy on the defense security element, because there's a kind of open door on working together on things like EDCA and maritime capacity and MDA and all of those issues that you know so well. So I am really quite optimistic about overall U.S.-Southeast Asia relations. I'd like to say, I know our time has come to a close, but, I am always mindful that whatever criticisms there are of the U.S. and whatever adaptations are required by new administrations in Washington, I see no evidence that counters my assessment that the U.S. remains the default desired partner of most countries in this region, not to mention elsewhere.
Yeah.
And that many countries will do things to adjust and adapt to keep that default relationship with the U.S. The way I've put it in writing before is, most countries will do a lot to stay on the good side of the United States and stay off the wrong side of China. And if that's what you mean by hedging,
that's a very good way of putting it.
The way I phrase it is, because to stay on the right side of the U.S. means adapting, being flexible, finding ways to work together despite some dissonance. Just staying off the wrong side of China doesn't require you to do much. It requires you not to take certain steps that just unnecessarily and gratuitously invite criticism and trouble. Those are distinctions with a difference. And I see nothing in my calculations about our U.S. Indo-Pacific relations that suggests anything different.
I won't be, that was a very witty way. I won't be surprised if someone would say, maybe this time it should be make sure we're on the right side of China and not on the wrong side of Trump. But kidding aside, thank you so much, Satu.
Wonderful.
Fantastic conversation. It just proves that we'll have to have more of this in the future. So don't worry please worry that I'll reach out to you and I'll try to trouble in the future, as we'll have more information about what's happening in the U.S.
Absolutely. Let's revisit in 6 months' time when we know who are the officials, what are some of the initial statements for this region.
And after midterm elections here, so I can prove you I'm right.
Midterm, that's right.
I can prove you I'm right.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much. Catch us again next week here on One News. You can also check out The Long Conversation on Spotify and YouTube. I'm Richard Heydarian, and that was The View from Manila, where One News, all sides, all the time.